So we crashed just to the side of the runway, just adjacent to the departure end, still on the airport property. And due to the slow airspeed, we didn't have to slide very far. But after we contacted the ground, the airplane flipped over backwards. But if you can picture yourself inverted on the ground and hanging by a seatbelt, I remember that window was just a couple inches from my face, and it was broken. And we had run over just a string of the rocks and grass and so forth. But I remember the first thing I saw when I kind of came to was a little bug crawling around that we had slid over, and it had made it. And then this weight of the situation hit me that, oh my gosh, we've just been through a plane crash.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 84 of the Aviation News Talk podcast. I'm your host, Max Truscott, and last week in episode 83, we talked with John Bone, who's planning to fly to Antarctica in a Cirrus next month. But today I'll be talking with Brandon Gonzales, who's an air traffic controller, and he'll tell us about things that pilots do that bug air traffic controllers. But first, if you're new to the show, we have a weekly show that shares pilot safety tips and general aviation news and helps connect you as part of a broader community that's championing general aviation around the world. And after the show, if you find yourself wanting just a little more content, go on out to our Patreon site at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and then click on the tab called Posts, where you can read the free stories that I post during the week between episodes. And if you like what you see, you can sign up to donate a few dollars a month, and then you get a few email notifications each week whenever I post a news story. That's at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. Earlier, I sat down with Brandon Gonzales, and here's our conversation. And now, before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about Brandon Gonzales. Gonzales is an air traffic controller at an airport in Southern California, but not only is he a controller, he's also a pilot and a flight instructor. He hosts the Podcasting on a Plane podcast, and he also provides voiceover and podcast production services, as well as mentors pilots. Brandon, I'd like to officially welcome you to the Aviation News Talk podcast. So excited to have you here.
Thanks, Max. I'm a longtime follower of you and your work, so it's an honor.
Well, I was on your show very recently, which is great, so thank you so much for that. I was doing a little bit of research before we decided that we would get together here, and I ran across something that struck me as amazing. It said that you've survived a plane crash, but I don't know anything about that. Can you tell us about that crash?
Sure, yeah. So my plane crash, that's sort of one of those pivotal moments in my life as an aviator where I was a child. I was 9 years old. It was actually just a couple months before my 10th birthday. And at that point in my life, I already knew that flying and aviation was something I wanted to be a part of. My dad would take me and we'd watch airplanes take off and land down at San Diego Lindbergh, and I always knew that was what I wanted to do. And a little part of me always looked at that control tower too and thought, I might want to work up in there also. But that was something we did together, and I have a lot of fond memories of that. And so when that plane crash happened, that was one of those moments where I had to make a choice of whether or not I was going to just forget it, give up, and never look back, or if I was going to make this more than just a job and a career path, but a mission. And I chose the latter, and it's a choice that I've never regretted. The circumstances surrounding the crash are kind of interesting. It was where I learned how to fly, actually, in Telluride, Colorado, which is known as being one of the highest airports in the country. The field elevation there is 9,078 feet, if I remember correctly. And we were departing from visiting the place we were going to move to. That's where the construction company my family worked for was going to open up a branch office, and this was sort of the return trip of the wives and kids trip to figure out where we were going to put down roots and live and pick out a house and all that. So as we departed Telluride, bound back for San Diego Montgomery in a Cessna 210, there were 6 of us in the 6-seat airplane, and we were not over gross or out of balance, but we were very close to the edge of the envelope on weight and balance. And the interesting thing about Telluride is that airport is situated such that 3 sides of the airport are a big canyon. And then on the north side of the airport is a very high ridge of mountains. So the wind situation can get very squirrely, for lack of a better term, without much warning, particularly in the spring and particularly in the late afternoon. And this was both. So as we departed, the pilot, who now that I look back and have knowledge on it, made a string of very bad choices, as would be expected in just about any chain leading up to an accident. But what he elected to do was to use the second notch of flaps on that Centurion, which I believe is 30 degrees, when, of course, the recommended flap setting would be 10. And also, he decided that he wanted to trade airspeed for altitude to try to climb above the adverse winds at the surface. Big mistake number 2, of course. So as we departed, we more or less stalled in a wind shear encounter. And he was able to recover it, but barely. And then during the recovery of the first stall, we had a secondary stall, which is what ultimately brought us down. So we crashed just to the side of the runway, just adjacent to the departure end, still on the airport property. And due to the slow airspeed, we didn't have to slide very far. But after we contacted the ground, the airplane flipped over backwards. And as I came to after the aircraft came to rest, I was in the very back seat. Again, I was a small child, and I was sitting next to the owner of the company's daughter. And we were about the same age at the time. And in the back seat of a Cessna Centurion, when you are there, the window, the rear window is right above your head, which is not something you'd spend a whole lot of time thinking about. But if you can picture yourself inverted on the ground and hanging by a seatbelt, I remember that window was just a couple inches from my face, and it was broken. And we had run over just a string of the rocks and grass and so forth. But I remember the first thing I saw when I kind of came to was a little bug crawling around that we had slid over, and it had made it. And then this weight of the situation hit me that, oh my gosh, we've just been through a plane crash. And then, of course, the chaos starts. And I remember as we were hanging there, somebody was trying to get through the baggage door to get us out. And that was the pilot. He had crawled out and he was trying to get us out that way. So as we were able to unhook our seatbelts and crawl out of what was left of the aircraft, I'm of course crawling on the ceiling. And the first thing I remember was the wife of the owner of the company, the co-pilot, was reaching for me and pulling me out. And as I crawled out onto the wing, which was below me, I remember just crawling through a mixture of fresh oil, avgas, and fresh blood. And it was a very intense experience. And then as we cleared the aircraft wreckage, I could see the airport fire trucks coming and so forth. But I remember looking back at that aircraft thinking, wow, we just came through that. And I remember knowing at that moment that I had a choice to make. And after, it all settled down a little bit, I decided, you know what? I want to fly and I want to be better than that. I want to make sure that something like this never happens to me or my family or anybody again. And I've kind of kept that lesson with me all throughout my flying career, having lived through an experience like that. And it's something now that, no matter what I do, I always remember that is a possibility. And we always need to keep that in the back of our minds.
Wow, that must have been quite an experience. And I think you're right. As pilots, we're always constantly trying to learn from others who have had accidents and trying to avoid, those kinds of things, happening to ourselves in the future. I'm wondering, in some ways, did that inspire you to become a flight instructor?
Yeah, absolutely. It did. When I see the decisions that people make that can lead to things like that, I know that it's very hard to change somebody's attitude, but as a CFI and as a mentor and as somebody that can really get in at the ground floor of when somebody first touches the controls of an airplane and is building all those knowledge and skills and attitude, I think that being a CFI is just such an epic responsibility, but it's also such an important one. And I think about that when I'm teaching anybody. I always look back to that crash that I was a part of. And unfortunately, since then, I've witnessed other ones as a controller, and we can talk about that later if you like. But yeah, being a CFI was a calling for me because not only do I like to teach and I like to fly, but as you well know, you can combine those two things together and kind of get something a little greater than the sum of its parts, don't you think?
Yeah, no question. My greatest satisfaction comes from teaching more so than flying by myself these days. So I'm kind of curious, tell us about the sequence of becoming pilot, CFI, air traffic controller. How did that all come about?
Sure. So after that incident, I knew that that's what I wanted to do with my career. So from then on, I took my first flying lesson when I was 14 years old. So we're talking about 4.5 years after that accident, and actually out of the same airport. That's where I learned how to fly. I was back in Telluride. And so for me, that was a big thing to overcome, but I knew it's what I wanted to do. So I worked through my certificates throughout high school. I was able to solo right around my 16th birthday. And then I went to college and I studied airline management when I was there. And the reason I did that was because I'd already achieved most of my certificates and ratings sort of in the private side of things outside of the university program. Although the university I went to was Purdue, and they have a fantastic program, which I would recommend to anybody. But again, I kind of went on the management side of things because I wanted to also understand the business of what it is that I wanted to do. And then after that, I graduated college. I was a CFI while I was there at Purdue. And then I also got a job at my home flight school where I did a lot of my certificates and ratings back here in San Diego. And I worked towards an airline career. That's what I always had wanted. And I actually did get there briefly. This is a story I've been kind of trying to decide how to tell on my own podcast as well. But let's just suffice to say, at the time and place, that airline was not the right place for me. So I ended up not sticking around with that. And I went back to being a full-time CFI. And a college friend of mine actually got me into the aircraft sales route, which was something that really appealed to me, given that it was with a manufacturer that I was very familiar with. And then also that it applied the business side of things that I'd learned so much of in college, and that it always fascinated me as well about aviation. So I was able to combine those two things together, and I had a pretty decent run in sales until the economic collapse in late 2007, early 2008. And luckily, the FAA was hiring at that point. So being a controller, like I said earlier, as I would sit there with my dad and watch airplanes down at Lindbergh, it was something I thought, you know what, I might want to do that too. And the time came, I was in my late 20s, and you cannot be hired to be a controller after your 31st birthday. So it was sort of a now or never situation. And luckily, the FAA was hiring off the street for the first time in 25 years. So I went ahead and used my contacts. I applied and got through the process and got picked up as a controller.
Now, I know from listening to your show that you don't usually talk about exactly which airport you're at, but just kind of describe for us in general the kind of airports you're at, and perhaps a little bit about the airspace and things like that close by, so people have a feel for where you work.
Sure. So my home airport is just outside of San Diego, actually on the north side. So we're just outside of San Diego and Miramar's Class Bravo airspace, but we're still south of Orange County. And our airspace is pretty simple. We're a Class Delta airspace airport with some echo extensions. But the nature of the aircraft that fly in and out of our airports and the operations that they're doing is just very broad and variable. We have everything from there's a guy who flies in a gyrocopter, little single-seat gyrocopter, all the way up to scheduled airline service in an ERJ 145. And we're a single runway airport, which a lot of people, when they first see my airport, they think, oh, that's just some sleepy little North County kind of situation. But the reality of it is, when we're mixing gyrocopters and scheduled 121 air carriers, things can get pretty interesting. So my airport is kind of its own little special animal up here in the north. And it's really neat, though, because we get a little bit of everything. So a little known fact is that in San Diego County, there are only 3 ILS approaches in the whole county. And one of them is to runway 9 at Lindbergh. So that's not really very usable for practice. But my airport and then Montgomery Field, the other popular general aviation airport around here, has it. So we are a very popular airport also for instrument practice. And sure, we think that it's mostly Cessnas and so on, but there is a citation, actually 2 schools on my field that specialize in Cessna citation jet training. So we have a fair amount of jet traffic actually practicing ILSs too to our airport. So a day at my place is, you're never really quite sure what you're going to get. And that's one of my favorite things about it.
That must be kind of fun to come to work and know that, yeah, it's going to be interesting. You just don't know how.
Exactly.
Well, so I'm really curious. One of my listeners had suggested that I talk with a controller to find out what some of their pet peeves are. So I wanted to ask you, what kinds of things do pilots do that really drive controllers nuts? Not necessarily at your field, but just kind of in general. Where would you start that conversation?
Well, I'd start it with a really nice disclaimer. So first off, real quick, I get this question a lot, and it's definitely a loaded question at best. So when I say the comments that I'm about to say here, I want to make sure that it's real clear that this is my opinion and not necessarily that of the FAA, but also that when I give these things that might qualify as pet peeves or gripes that controllers have, it's coming from a place of, these are things that I'm going to give you the background on so you can see why they're that way. And then you can really, as a pilot, take those things and get a little bit more insight into what we do behind the scenes, and that it's not really a dark art, and it's usually a much simpler reason than you'd think. So when I give talks in front of pilot groups, these are the questions that I've sort of compiled over time that people do tend to ask me. Are you ready to start?
Sure. Now, are these in rank order?
You know what? They're not. I thought about doing it that way, but it kind of just depends on the situation, just like most things in aviation. So it kind of just depends on what the situation is, how you're going to rank order them. So I'm just going to go in no particular order, but a good place to start would be And I'm going to say this saying, it's an oldie but a goodie. And I first heard it from one of my favorite professors at Purdue, who unfortunately passed a little while back, but his name was Mitch Grunman. And his mantra was monitor the freq before you speak. And he really taught me that well. And what that meant was, of course, anytime before you key up on a frequency to make a transmission, make sure you spend just a second listening to what's going on. Now, it might not be to get a full picture of the traffic. That could take minutes or longer, but just to make sure that maybe somebody didn't finish a transmission that is going to definitely require a readback or a response. So sometimes we work two frequencies as well. And it's hard to figure that out for pilots sometimes because we may or may not be broadcasting on both of the frequencies that we're working. This often happens late at night and so on when sectors are combined or there's not as many positions open in the tower. But if I say something or pilot says something that is perhaps a question or a clearance for something that would definitely require a readback, make sure that you don't take that opportunity to key up and interject that you're just checking in on the frequency, unless, of course, you have a real need to do so.
And I see two different flavors of this. I see pilots who, when they get a change in the air to another frequency, the moment they switch frequencies, they'll punch the mic button. I said to somebody one time, so how many milliseconds did you leave before you started talking? And you said none. And that was, definitely the case there. The other thing I see is that sometimes just before pilots start to speak, they'll hear just a fraction of a syllable, meaning someone else has started to speak, but they'll go ahead and push the key and talk anyway.
Yes, exactly that. You're exactly right. And sometimes you don't even hear the syllable of them talking. You just hear the click of somebody else keying up a mic to go hot. And yeah, if you hear any click or anything, that means somebody else is about to do the same thing you were. And I know sometimes you're so ready to press that button, but just try to resist doing it just for a second.
Okay, so what's number two?
Okay, number two, as a tower controller, and again, a lot of these that I'm going to have are from the tower controller perspective. This happened actually to me today. About 2 hours ago, right before we recorded this, is I had a gap that was big enough to get an aircraft out, and things were pretty busy. The pattern was busy. And of course, no controller wants to delay a pilot on the ground. We want to get you on your way and get you moving. But every once in a while, there's maybe, for instance, a departure gap, and you've got a guy waiting to go. And to some pilots, they might be the kind of guy that would say, hey, you can easily get me out here. I'm chomping at the bit. Let's go. And then another pilot might say, that gap's too small. Don't hurry me. But we like to give you the option because we don't really know which type of pilot you are. So, for instance, we might clear you for immediate takeoff. And at that point, some pilots will accept it, but then not really do it. And that's a big issue. So if you're ready and willing to take an immediate takeoff, then go for it. But if you're uncomfortable doing that, because the last thing any of us would want to do would be to hustle you into something you're not ready to do, then you can politely decline and say, hey, you know what, I'd rather just hold short. In which case we'll cancel the clearance and that's fine. But if you choose to take it and then realize a couple seconds in that you were definitely not prepared to do it, then we're probably going to have a problem.
So here's a question for you. If you were in the airplane and the controller gave you an immediate takeoff, when would you start applying throttle? While the controller was still talking, as you started to talk, when you were finished talking?
Well, I suppose it would depend on where I am. If I was a little bit back in the run-up area, or I wasn't quite approaching the hold bars yet. For instance, if I was in a jet or a turboprop, controllers are going to assume you're ready as you approach the end. If I still had a little taxi time, I'd say, okay, cleared immediate takeoff, read back my call sign, and I would taxi out there. I wouldn't necessarily do it at a way faster than normal rate, but I would just make sure that I don't go out there, taking my time, being very slow, then get out on the runway, do a static run up, and then depart. I would just more or less kind of take it on the roll. However, you're right. I see a lot of people that will just almost go to full power straight from the run-up area and just go ripping around that turn. And I can assure you that probably wasn't what the controller expected. And I've actually been bitten by that before. Okay, and then there are others who might say, okay, well, all right, cleared for immediate takeoff. And then I can just picture them pulling out the checklist. Okay, flaps are set, lights on as required, transponder, standby, okay. And then they start moving. And I think that would be taking a little bit too long. So as a controller, I would expect on an immediate takeoff that you release the brakes, let it start rolling, go through your checklist as appropriate, and more or less just kind of depart on the roll, quote unquote.
And you don't have a problem if I start rolling as you're finishing your transmission?
No, as long as I've said the magic words, then you are free to cross the hold bars and start doing it.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I find sometimes people will sit and wait, give the full readback, and then start to move. And as soon as I hear you say the words "clear to," boom, I start to move if it's going to be tight getting out.
Sure.
All right. So what's number 3 on your list?
Okay, well, on a similar line of thinking to if you can't comply with a clearance is what if you don't understand a clearance? And a lot of pilots will be afraid to ask for a clarification because they think it maybe makes them sound amateurish, or perhaps they're afraid that the controller is going to give them some attitude back. But if you don't understand a clearance, no matter what it is, then please, please, please ask for clarification, because we often see pilots who just sort of do what they thought they wanted or what the controller wanted. And I don't need to explain how that could get out of hand very quickly. So we use standard phraseology for things, but the book that we use, it's called the 7110.65, prescribes phraseology for just about all normal stuff and some abnormal stuff. But sometimes we have to just do our best in coming up with a official sounding way to explain something that might not really be covered by the book by using our judgment. And if you don't understand what we said, that's perfectly acceptable. And if you come back then and say, hey, you know what, I don't really get that, can I get some clarification? Then that actually frees us up to use plain language to talk with you, which I'm sure is what you'd probably prefer anyway. So what I always say is if you don't understand anything, always, always, always ask. And if a controller gives you attitude back for asking what the right thing was to do, well, you can give them my phone number and I'll give them a talking to.
Well, so my favorite would be if a controller is, doing something wrong, is I'll just say to them, advise when ready to copy a phone number.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. A phone number doesn't always mean you are wrong. Now there's going to be paperwork and a deviation, because on a frequency of an operational frequency running an airport is probably not the place to discuss minutia. But, a phone call when we're outside the operational environment and out of the stress of all of it can be a really good place to just sort of take the edge off and just talk out what we mean. And I've seen both controllers and pilots really learn a lot from hearing the other person's side when we're outside of a stressful environment.
Well, I think you missed it. It would be me, the pilot, telling the controller to copy a phone number.
That works both ways, doesn't it?
I've always wanted to do that, but I've never done that. So tell me a little bit about the differences between immediately versus expedite.
Well, that's a great question. So one of my favorite places to look and my favorite places to direct people is the pilot controller glossary. And I remember you've mentioned that in one of your last episodes. And in addition to the FARs and the AIM and our manual, the 7110.65, the pilot controller glossary is one of my favorite books because it really just gives a simple description of, when you think, what does that word mean? What does that mean? Well, it tells you exactly what that word means. So when we use the word immediate or immediately, that's used by air traffic, and this is straight out of the book, when such action compliance is required to avoid an imminent situation. And then the word expedite, we would use that to, for instance, when prompt compliance is required to avoid the development of an imminent situation. So I guess that's really the difference. Expedite is to avoid the imminent situation developing, and then immediately is kind of once it has started developing. But you're usually going to hear expedite during climb and descent clearances, like expedite through particular altitude. And that would just indicate to a pilot that the best rate of climb or descent should be used, but not really require an exceptional change in aircraft handling characteristics. Like, we're not asking you to do anything extreme. It's just, don't delay and do a really smooth, that kind of long-winded, comfortable one. Really make it a point to get down to that altitude or up to that altitude.
Now I can see expedite being used by an approach controller, for example. When do you use it as a tower controller?
A lot of times we'll say, for instance, I cleared you for takeoff. Not an immediate, nothing like that. But perhaps the aircraft on final hasn't slowed as much as I had anticipated him to. Or sometimes some pilots, maybe they're training, maybe not, whatever, but they'll take a really long time going around the turn to get established on the runway and depart. And every once in a while we might say, if able, expedite. Or for instance, in an aircraft lands, if there's another aircraft very close in behind them and they seem to be slowing to maybe an unreasonably slow speed on the runway before exiting, we might tell them, expedite, turn left at such and such taxiway due to traffic on short funnel behind you. So it wouldn't be to hustle somebody in a way that means do something dangerous or exceptional with your aircraft. It just means, kind of mean it.
Yeah, I understand. And I suppose the pilot, if they feel that, no, I really do need to proceed this slowly, and if the aircraft behind them has to go around, that's just an okay situation, right?
Sure. You can always go around, that's for sure. And as a tower controller, I can tell you that a go around is something that I have always planned for 100% of the time. Rule number one at a tower is don't set up a situation where a go around is going to ruin the whole thing, because that's one of those not negotiable parts of aviation. You can always go around. And if a pilot's unable to comply with something, well, then you have the pilot and command authority to state unable. However, with that comes a little bit of a responsibility to perhaps offer an alternative or something that you could do, or maybe a decent reason why not. It kind of depends on the situation, though.
That's kind of interesting. It makes total sense to me to always plan from a controller standpoint that one of your aircraft may have to go around. What do you do from a planning standpoint to set it up so that they can go around?
Well, option number one is don't ever have anybody just off the departure end that cannot move. For instance, we have a lot of helicopters at our airport, and that's fine. There's a lot of survey work. There's some power lines getting constructed there. And every once in a while, you'll have a helicopter that wants to sit there and sort of just hang out. But we have to just know that that aircraft's there. And typically, they're at a low enough altitude that it really doesn't matter anyway. But we have a lot of transitions that go overhead. And one rule would be to always have an overhead transition be at a high enough altitude that if somebody were to go around, they wouldn't immediately be a problem for them. And another situation would be is don't lock up the runway such that you've got an aircraft departing, a minimum space to line up somebody and wait, and then a minimum amount of space with an aircraft that can't slow down on final, for instance, like a jet or something like that. And that would pretty much gridlock you into having to move somebody. And you always need to know which aircraft is the one that you're going to move. And for instance, in that case, it might be whoever you put in position, you would just tell them to taxi back off the runway. But you always need to set up everything so that that departure corridor is completely clear if somebody needed to go around.
Got it. And when you send somebody around, are there times that you send them back to approach control, or do you always just keep them in the pattern?
Sure. Well, it depends on what they were doing. If it's a VFR Cessna on the pattern, then yeah, of course they're just gonna stay with me. If it was an IFR jet, well, it depends. If the conditions are IFR, then yes, they're going to go out on the published missed approach or a coordinated alternative, and they're going to go back to approach for revectoring. But if it's VFR, then they may elect to not want to go back to approach and just stay with me, more or less in a visual approach type scenario. And we'll, of course, coordinate that with the approach controller, what they're going to do and how far out we're going to send them. But they have that option, usually if it's VFR, to stay with us.
Okay, good explanation. What's next on your Hot 100 list?
Okay, so repeating everything back verbatim. Now, I know when we're learning to speak this new language of pilot and air traffic control, there's a tendency to want to read back everything that the controller told you to a T, because sometimes you're not comfortable enough speaking the language and you want to just for practice or for whatever reason, maybe just to make sure that you actually got it all and the controller can check you, that you're going to read back every single thing that that guy told you to the letter. And unfortunately, sometimes though, only one person can talk at a time on this party line, and that can take an awful lot of time. So while I appreciate the effort, sometimes we don't want to read back everything. And some real fun words that I really like are words like Roger, which of course the meaning of that is I hear and understand your message. Wilco, which is I will comply with whatever it is you just told me. Or just kind of knowing the way that a clearance readback would go, like a heading or an altitude, and then whatever the clearance was itself. And having that very simple way of just reading it back can really save a lot of trouble.
Yes, I agree. Wilco is one of my favorite phrases. I'm always trying to encourage people to use that because it saves so much time. And I do find it's hard sometimes to get pilots not to just read back everything verbatim, which on a busy frequency really chews up the bandwidth. Do you find that people confuse Roger and affirmative?
Yes, absolutely. And that was the one that slipped my mind as I was kind of talking there is, yeah, affirmative just means yes. Nothing more, nothing less.
Yeah, and I sometimes slip into using Roger for yes, and occasionally the controller will come back to me to get that clarified. So what's next on the list?
Okay, how about let's do hold short readbacks. Now, in the FAA, it's no surprise that runway incursion avoidance has been a hot button issue for quite some time. In the former PTS, now the ACS, that's an area that has to be emphasized. And it's part of all check rides. It's part of training for us as controllers. And anytime you hear the words hold short of whatever, that has to be read back. And this is one thing actually that has to be read back in its entirety verbatim. And it has to include the runway number or whatever it is you're told to hold short of, the words hold short, and your call sign. So if I say Cessna 123, hold short of runway 24, then the guy comes back and says, okay, we're holding short. Well, unfortunately, that doesn't cut it. We have to have all three of those things. So it has to be Cessna 123, will hold short of runway 24 or something like that. As long as all three of those pieces are there, that constitutes a good readback. And we are actually audited for that kind of stuff. And if we don't get a good readback on that, we're actually required to correct you and have you say it again the proper way.
And what about the call sign? Does it have to be the full call sign?
It doesn't. It just has to be a legitimate repetition of your call sign. The last three is okay.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering about that. I know at least one tower locally here where they insist on the full call sign, and yet other towers don't seem to. So I just give them the full call sign regardless of where I am.
Sure. I think that part might be up for a little bit of interpretation just because of the way the rule was written. But yeah, as long as the call sign to clearly identify which aircraft it is in there, that's the important part. And a lot of people actually, and I'm guilty of this myself sometimes as on the pilot side of things, might get a little bit lazy. And if you have a quick back and forth with the controller, you might drop using your call sign every once in a while just because, you feel like it's kind of obvious it's me. But that is a sloppy habit, and we all need to be careful about it. And during a hold short readback, yeah, that call sign definitely has to be in there.
Well, let's talk about call signs for just a moment, because I see people will often not give their call sign back. Talk about, and not just necessarily in the hold short position, talk about in general why it's important for pilots to give their call sign in a transmission.
Well, from an operational standpoint, we're sitting there looking at a sea of airplanes, and we're talking to you with a two-way radio. And if it's the same voice coming back to us, okay, I can be pretty sure who it is, but there could be more than one pilot in the cockpit of an airplane, so suddenly it's a different voice saying the same call sign. And we can't just do it based on the voice we thought we heard because we may only have you for one or two transmissions. So we need to know that for certain which aircraft it is that we're talking to, because it often will happen that there might be a similar sounding call sign on frequency, or even if it's not really that similar sounding, sometimes you just pick up on something, think it was for you, read it back, and turns out it wasn't. And so if you don't include that call sign readback, you can have an airplane more or less going rogue on you and not really be sure what instruction or whose instruction they took. And, it doesn't take much thought to see how that situation could deteriorate rapidly. And then also it's a legal requirement, as things are reconstructed and our tapes get audited and things like that. It doesn't hold up in any legal scenario that if you don't have a name on something or a call sign on something, there's really no way to prove who did or did not say that. So it's very, very important that we always use the call sign in any transmission, even if it's the shortened version, just to be sure that we're talking to the right airplane.
Yeah, there are lots of times when I'm flying in the cockpit and a call has been given to us by ATC and somebody else grabs it and then goes to switch frequency or something like that. And I'm always telling my pilots, unless you say your call sign, they're not going to know if the right person grabbed the call and changed frequency.
Absolutely. And I remember actually one of our recurrent trainings about a year ago had a situation like that where an airliner had taken the instructions for another airliner from the same airline, but with just a different flight number. And then you could see on the radar it happened because they both responded at the same time. You got the squeal noise when two people transmit at the same time. But the controller was having difficulty figuring out which other airplane it was that took that call sign or that took that instruction. And he had to figure it out as eventually the rogue airplane went, and they had to go track down what frequency he had gone to put him back on course. And that could have been much uglier than it was. Luckily, they caught it quickly.
Yeah, I'm thinking of an accident that occurred a number of years ago in Southern California. There were 4 cargo planes at night flying the same route in sequence. And I think number 4 took the instruction that went for number 3. And unfortunately, it was a fatal crash into terrain because of that. So these things can be pretty serious.
Absolutely.
Okay, what else is on the list here?
Okay, let's do some traffic calls. So this is one of those things where usually a traffic call is a quick thing and something we want to get you seeing another airplane so you can follow them or avoid them or whatever the case may be. But one of my favorite responses when I issue a traffic call is, all right, we got them on the fish finder. And it's cute and it's fun. And I guess I know what you mean, but unfortunately that doesn't actually count legally in air traffic. So when we issue a traffic call, a very good flight instructor I had once back in the day, he told me that there's really only 2 responses to a traffic call, and it's either looking or traffic in sight. And he wanted me to not use the word traffic unless I had the traffic in sight. And I always thought that was pretty good advice, and I brought it with me throughout my flying career. And I still would tend to agree with that. There's really only 2 situations you can have if you've received a traffic call, because either you see them or you don't, right? So if you see them, great, traffic in sight. And if you don't see them, well, just tell me you're looking. But unfortunately, seeing them on TCAS or ADSB or whatever, while it's a great tool and you know exactly where to look, that doesn't actually count for us in air traffic.
And is it helpful for you to know, for example, if I were to give a readback, I've got them on the TCAS and I'm looking, or is that just extra information that I have it on the traffic display and you don't really care?
Well, it kind of depends on the situation, just like anything. Unfortunately, it doesn't really count legally for anything. Like I can't have you apply visual separation that way. It doesn't really count for any other type of separation either. But sometimes it might be nice to know that you're flying in the aircraft that has some fancy avionics that can do it. But I think more or less that is something that is for you. And what I just need to know is whether or not you do or don't see the traffic.
Okay. And of course, if I do see it, then the next words I'm going to hear from you are?
Well, it depends on the situation, but chances are it will be follow them or issue your sequence or, maneuver is necessary to avoid them or whatever, whatever the case may be.
Yeah. And I'm so used to the phrase maintain visual separation.
Sure.
And I guess that would be more likely from an approach controller. I guess that's not something you'd be saying that often as a tower controller.
Yeah, it does come up at the tower sometimes. Particularly, we can do some certain things with helicopters with visual separation that you can't do with fixed wing, which is really nice. So yeah, I do say that. But proper visual separation, you're going to hear that a lot more in radar environments where there's a specific amount of separation that may need to exist between you and that other aircraft. Because the difference at the tower is that I have windows and binoculars and I can see you. So visual separation to me means I can see you too and help you out. But in a radar environment where they're in a remote building that could be hundreds of miles away, it doesn't work that way. So you guys need to see each other or you need to see the other person or something in order for visual separation to be applied.
Sure. And up to that point where I see that person, then really, I guess it's still the controller's responsibility to try and keep us separated?
That's correct. Yeah, they're going to be affording you, I mean, again, it depends on the situation, but they would be affording you whatever separation is required for that situation until the point that you can do it because you actually can see them.
Sure. And at that point, I'm now responsible. And if I lose sight of that aircraft, what should I be doing?
You should probably say that.
Yeah, exactly. All right, good. So let's talk about airports in phonetics.
Oh, that's always a fun one, isn't it? So phonetically spelling the airport identifier can actually be very appropriate sometimes, particularly if it's an airport that's very far away or maybe one of those obscure ones that has letters and numbers in it that people might not be familiar with. However, we get a lot of times pilots that will be requesting, for instance, an IFR clearance to a local airport that's relatively close or within our tower and route system. And they'll start by saying that they want a clearance to Kilo, Mike, Yankee, Foxtrot, or something like that. And okay, that's fine. It's not incorrect. But first off, the Kilo part, that's kind of a running joke on the internet about say no to Kilo. But I know you're in the United States. It's okay. So we can probably drop the Kilo unless, of course, it's relevant for some other reason. Sometimes people use that just to separate. For instance, if there's a VOR Navigate on the field that has the same three-letter identifier, they might use the Kilo in that case. But 99% of the time, I probably don't need the Kilo. But then also, it takes a lot more psychological energy for me to figure out what you're spelling than if you just say the name of the airport you want to go to. And then when I type it in on the keyboard, well, my hands are naturally just going to type those words in. But for me to try to decode something and then recode it so that I can type it in code, that takes 2 to 3 times as much effort for me than if you just said, I want IFR clearance to Montgomery.
Okay. Now, in the very beginning of that response, you mentioned tower and route system. I know a lot of pilots are not familiar with that, and you use that a lot in Southern California. We don't use it that much up here in Northern California. Explain to people what that is.
Yeah, tower and route control is an interesting thing. It only exists in areas that are usually very, very densely populated urban areas, which have a TRACON that covers the entire flight. For instance, you're never going to leave the TRACON's airspace and go to the center. Every once in a while, maybe you go through a sector of it, but for the most part, it's an in-house type of IFR clearance. And people actually used to call it tower to tower, where I think there was a way that you could just go from one tower's airspace to another one if they were close enough that they were virtually touching each other. And you may not even have gone to approach at that point. But what it means for us in Southern California, since we're under a what you call a giant consolidated super TRACON, which is SoCal approach, there are some other ones like NorCal, Potomac, things like that, that you're never going to go really into the in-route structure and talk to the center. You're just going to be in-house, so to speak, the whole time. So what we'll do is we have some coded routes that we're going to give you very much like a preferential routing between two popular cities that airliners might use. We're just going to give you the same routing that kind of routes you through the complicated maze of approaches and departure corridors for very densely populated areas. So for instance, if you wanted to go from my airport up to, say, an airport in the Los Angeles area, you're going to receive the same clearance all the time. There's a place in the chart supplement that you can look up what that clearance is going to be. And that way you know what's coming. We're all going to issue it the same way. There's really not a whole lot of room for interpretation. And it doesn't go out to the center. It just stays within the TRACON's airspace.
Now, if I want a tower en route, can I just call up on ground or clearance delivery to get that? Is that going to be simpler for you than if I were to call up and try and fly to Indiana from your airport and call ground to get a clearance I hadn't filed?
Exactly. And thank you for reminding me that. Yeah, the main point that you bring up there is just that you don't have to pre-file that way. And what we'll do is we'll just type it in, and between the two airport pairs, the system will automatically issue that route, as opposed to when you're leaving the airspace and you're going to have to file through whatever source you like to do that through. But that way we'll get a flight strip and all that. Whereas if you just want a tower en route, we'll just type it in and it just stays in-house and you don't really need to pre-file it.
That's great. And that really doesn't bother you if I do that?
No, it doesn't. I mean, if you want to pre-file it, that's fine. It'll save me a couple seconds typing it in. But for the most part, that's part of my job description. So no, you can just call for it.
Okay, great. What's next on your list of pet peeves?
Sure, just a couple more here. At the tower, this happens every once in a while. It happened to me last week once. I'll clear an aircraft for takeoff, and I feel like there might be a little bit of a misunderstanding in the pilot community about where the appropriate place is to turn your crosswind. And sometimes you'll be working a pattern full of airplanes, and they'll all be turning crosswind about the time you expect, but then someone will depart, and they'll just more or less lift off, make a right turn out, and that's it. And that can be very dangerous because they can cut out their traffic, and it happens so quickly that it's hard for a controller to notice, particularly since it's happening on the departure end of the runway. And unfortunately, at my home airport, it wasn't this that caused it, but in that same place that the problem would occur, we did have a fatal midair collision about 15 years ago. And so this is something that, particularly at my airport, hits a little close to home, but you definitely don't want to turn crosswind unexpectedly or too early. And the AIM says that the typical place that you want to turn crosswind would be 300 feet below traffic pattern altitude, right?
Yeah, exactly. I'm telling pilots that all the time, and most of them look at me like I've just made that up. I don't think most pilots actually know that.
Yeah, it's kind of a fun one because I'll ask groups a lot of times, and nobody wants to answer in front of their peers, and that's fine. But I'll say, hey, where do you turn crosswind? And the answer is usually hovers somewhere around about 500 AGL or about half a mile off the departure end. And, I can see where those people kind of get those things, but really that's unfortunately not correct. And that the answer is 300 feet below the traffic pattern altitude. And so that's when we expect you to do it. And a lot of times if I issue a takeoff clearance to an aircraft that's departing behind somebody in the pattern, I'll make a special point to tell them, hey, that aircraft in front of you, he is staying in the right closed traffic pattern. Make sure to make the turnout behind him. And usually they're like, oh, okay, great. Thanks for letting me know. Because you never really know who knows that rule and who doesn't. And at our airport, our traffic pattern is actually a little on the high side. And we have a couple of big 141 schools on the airport, and they're very good at teaching those rules, and the students read them and they know them. But at our airport, if you were to turn 300 feet below TPA, it actually extends your upwind pretty far just because you have to climb so high, particularly on a hot day. And it's very easy to have a Cessna that is going the same direction in front of you ahead and lose sight of them and feel like, okay, now's my time to turn crosswind and turn. And then the aircraft that was in front of you that you were supposed to go behind is going to just cut right into you. So it's something that at my airport comes up kind of a lot. So yeah, I think to make the point here is that 300 feet below TPA is where the AIM says you should probably do it.
And I find sometimes that our tower will extend our upwind just because the pattern is expanding a little bit, and they may not tell the person behind me to fly as far upwind as they told me, and then oops, I got to watch out for that person turning early and cutting me out.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, it's when you get very busy, sometimes it's easy to forget that you told the last three guys, but then this person just came on frequency and they haven't been here listening to the whole situation, so they don't know yet.
All kinds of gotchas out there. All right. What else do you have?
Sure. One more quick one, and then my all-time favorite. Every once in a while, we'll have somebody do a touch and go when they're cleared to land. And they're just waiting to hear maybe those magic words, cleared to whatever, land, touch and go. It's all the same thing. Some of the controllers at my airport, we kind of get in the habit of clearing people for the option because, again, there's a lot of training and, we want to facilitate that. So we do the best we can. But at the same time, if you've been cleared to land, even if you had requested maybe a touch and go with your initial call up when you called inbound, but I was real busy, I might not remember that. And I'm supposed to, I do make a marking on my pad that you wanted touch and goes, but if things are real busy, it might be possible to overlook that. So if I make the mistake and clear you to land when your request was a touch and go, then definitely say something and make sure you correct me, because if I clear you to land, then that's what I'm expecting. And I've had it happen recently a few times where that was what I expected. And then here goes the guy doing a touch and go. And usually it's not too awful because, like I said, you've protected for a go around. So if the guy does a touch and go that you didn't expect, it might not be the worst thing in the whole wide world, but at the same time, it's not correct. And we want to make sure that if you don't get the clearance you expect, then make sure you exercise your PIC authority and say something. And one of the funny ones is the instructors all figured out that if their student were to do that and they didn't catch it fast enough, I often get that, we bounced and we went around. It's their excuse. So I kind of laugh it off, but always make sure that if you're not cleared for the thing you expected, that you correct me.
Yeah, I think that raises a couple different issues. First of all, I think people in aviation should come clean. If you made a mistake, don't just make stuff up. And what you're highlighting here is that some people are kind of embarrassed or afraid they'll get violated because they did a touch and go when they were cleared to land. But the other thing I'm wondering is, I find that a lot of pilots don't really notice whether they've been cleared for the option or cleared to land. And I have to point out to them, hey, tell the controller that's not what you were looking to do. Just generically, someone's coming from the pattern from, some unknown place. Do you generically clear them to land or clear them to the option? When do you decide one versus the other if the pilot hasn't said anything?
Yeah, so assuming that the airplane is just inbound, whether or not they called me, they'll usually say inbound for landing with, the ATIS information or whatever it is. I'm going to assume that you just want to come in and land unless you specifically ask me for some pattern work in, so many words. There's a few ways to ask for that. But if you want the option or you want to touch and go, then all you need to do is say so. The FAA had a thing a while back where they didn't want us issuing open-ended clearances if they weren't requested. So just clearing somebody for the option, if you weren't sure, they didn't really want that. They wanted us to make sure that if you want to land, we'll clear you to land. If you want the option, well, sure, I'll issue an option clearance, but you really had to request that. Or if you requested a touch and go, they didn't want us just saying the option. They wanted us to clear you for the touch and go that you requested. And I think that was in an effort to decrease ambiguity and so on. And there's definitely a lot of merit to that. So I'll clear you to land unless you tell me you want something else. But if I make the mistake and, you wanted touch and goes, maybe you forgot to tell me, maybe I just forgot, then definitely, clear it up and then we'll issue the proper clearance.
Now, years ago, we had a controller at one of the towers here who I think earlier in his career must have been burned for assuming that somebody wanted to land and they didn't. And I'm guessing, his bosses were all over him about that, because this is what he would do. And I would hear this all the time. An aircraft would be inbound and call the tower with their call sign and tell them they have information echo, but they wouldn't say the word landing. And so the controller would say things like, Roger, or he would just ignore the person. And what he was waiting to do was for them to finally say landing with echo. Is there a specific requirement that I have to say landing, or are you allowed to assume that that's what I want to do if I call you?
Well, that's kind of an interesting question. I feel like that might be one of those ambiguous things where I don't know that it really says that you do or don't have to do that anywhere. And actually, if anybody listening does know the answer to that, I'd be curious. But I'm going to assume that you want to land. I would prefer that you would say that unless you want something else. But I mean, ultimately, the point of an airport is to take off or land, right? But if you want to do some other playing while you're here, then I feel like that would be the thing that would require the request. But I guess the moral of the story is I'm not actually sure if you have to say that or if I can just assume it. But realistically speaking, I will assume it unless you tell me otherwise.
Sure, because the vast majority of people are landing. It would be relatively few people that would call you up that want to just transition your airspace and not actually tell you that. And I would assume they're going to tell you that if they want to do that.
Exactly, sure. And if people want to transition, they're going to say, hey, I want a northbound transition overhead or over the 5 freeway or whatever. And, on the practice missed approaches that we get a lot on the ILSs and the GPS approaches, that's pre-coordinated with SoCal approach. So there's a little code that's put in the data tag. So I already know what your next request is going to be. And in that case, I will give you missed approach instructions and assume that you're not going to land. However, in the nature of good training, oftentimes as a CFII, when I have a student on an ILS and we're going to go missed, I might have them complete a touch and go just so they can practice that transition from seeing the runway at the DA and then actually putting it down on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
but that would be a separate request.
Okay. Well, tell us about your all-time favorite.
Okay, here we are. Drum roll, my all-time favorite. And this is pilots that are in the pattern turning base on their own without receiving a sequence. So there was an article written a while back, and I think it was an AOPA flight training article, and I cannot find it, but it talked a lot about where it says that you can or can't do that. And it's kind of a process of putting together a lot of different little bits of information and then kind of just applying some good judgment. But I have one person at the airport who doesn't really seem to be able to get it through their head that they can't turn base whenever they like if I don't issue them a clearance. And at an airport like mine, where we have jets on the ILS constantly, I mean, I'm including scheduled air carriers here, I don't think I need to explain much to paint the picture of how dangerous that could be if a pilot just takes it on themselves to turn base whenever they like ahead of whoever just happens to be on final. Because I do realize the argument here that I get is that, well, you should have cleared me when I was on downwind. And yeah, that's a valid argument. The controller probably should have cleared you when you were on downwind. However, there is an awful lot going on in the background sometimes, and the controller may not have forgotten about you. They might be coordinating something of higher importance on a landline, and they're going to get right back with you. But if you're on downwind and you haven't received a clearance or a sequence, then I would say just say something. Because the issue is that if you just go ahead and choose when to turn base, there could be somebody on final that you didn't know was there. And that's going to happen so quick. I would hope that I would catch it, but I may not have time to. So at any tower for a VFR operation, we're going to provide a sequence to the arriving runway in terms of number 5, follow the aircraft on a 6-mile final. Or if you're number 1, we would just say cleared to land or cleared for the option. I usually throw in that you're number 1 just to make it real clear, but you don't really know what your sequence is until you're issued it. So if you just go ahead and take the liberty to turn base whenever you like, that could be catastrophic before anybody can even see it.
And for a pilot who is downwind and is about to turn base but hasn't received a sequence, what would you suggest as an efficient phrase for them to ask you for their sequence?
They might just say, hey, Cessna 123 is right downwind. Something as simple as that. I mean, again, the book doesn't necessarily have a specific phrase that has to be said, but just something to remind the controller or whatever. I mean, chances are the controller knows they're just coordinating something else, but on the off chance that maybe they missed it or they thought that they had cleared you but didn't, put a check mark next to the wrong one or something like that, then just, hey, I'm past the numbers, and then that'll definitely cue the controller to issue the sequence or the clearance as appropriate.
Sure. Yeah, I'll often say, I'd like to get my sequence or about to turn base or something like that. There's a phrase that's come up in air traffic control in recent years. It's about that same place where you might be turning base, and that's the phrase continue. Can you tell folks when you use that and what that means when they hear that?
Sure. Continue is one of those things where I always kind of chuckle a little bit too, because particularly when it's to an airplane that checks in on final, it's not really like they have a choice, right? I mean, they can't not continue because we all know what happens if you try to stop in the air, right? But continue really just means that I need you to continue what you're doing because something prevents me issuing the clearance or the sequence yet. And the biggest one for me where this comes up is in terms of line up and wait procedures. Now, if you're at a big airport, like, for instance, the Class Bravos or a lot of the Charlies that have ASDE, which is the airport surface detection equipment, they are allowed to issue, for the most part, a landing clearance to an arriving aircraft and then still have somebody line up and wait ahead of them. At my airport, where we do not have ASDX, it doesn't work that way. So I'm not allowed to issue a landing clearance to an arriving aircraft until an aircraft that I've put in line up and wait has started their takeoff roll. So if I'm going to line up an airplane or two in front of this guy, then I have to tell them to just continue, and then I'll give the reason, traffic holding in position, or continue, unable to issue clearance due to whatever, and then I'll usually throw in where to expect it. But continue just means, yep, keep on carrying on like you were, and then whatever it is you're expecting, the clearance or the sequence will probably come at a later time.
That's great. So let's look at the flip side just briefly here. As a controller, what kinds of things do you think pilots generally do pretty well, or what kinds of things do they do that you're really grateful that they do?
Well, I really believe that most pilots out there have a great attitude towards air traffic control, and they don't really consider it as an impediment to their existence. They consider it to be a government-provided service, which is, in fact, what it is. Now, there's always going to be the couple on the fringes that don't really feel that way, but for the most part, I always appreciate pilots that have that attitude, and they really do their best to comply with what we tell them and really realize that it's all in the nature of safety and efficiency. But one thing that I've been noticing lately, and this is in the Southern California area in particular, is there seems to be a movement for pilots to try to procure flight following services on just about every flight where they're going from point A to point B. And I really respect that, because I think that it really shows that that pilot who asks for a service like that knows how to operate in the air traffic control system. And it shows that they're willing to go both ways with it. Like, I'm going to go to you to get radar services for me so that we can have a dialogue opened up. And then you know who I am. I'm not just some guy flying around. And then you can help me stay safe as well. And I just think that really shows a lot for the character of a pilot that is willing to work in this system in that way. And it shows mastery of it too.
Well, Brandon, this has been really excellent. Thanks so much for hitting on all the little nuances here. And I just want to find out, for listeners who are interested in finding more about you and your show, where do they go?
Sure. Well, my website is podcastingonaplane.com, and you can learn more about me and see all our past episodes. We have them archived all the way back to episode number 1. I have some links to some other good aviation sites and goodies and things like that at the website. And if you want to just go straight to the podcast, you can get that, of course, on iTunes, or Apple Podcasts, I should say now. It's available from Google Play, Stitcher, pretty much anywhere that you get your podcasts. Just search for Podcasting on a Plane. It should work as either all one word, or if you make it, break it up into its separate words, you should still get there. And that's where you can find me.
Well, we can also find you on the air, right?
That's right. And if you figured out where I work, you can always give me a VHF shout out, I like to call them, as you fly by.
I'll try and do that someday. Brandon, thank you so very much for coming on the show and sharing all this with our listeners today.
Anytime. It was a pleasure.
Well, you'll definitely want to check out Brandon's podcast at podcastingonaplane.com. The current episode number 32 is Are You Ready for Your Engine Failure? And in episode 31, he had me on the show, and we talked about a couple of different Cirrus accidents where ATC communication played at least some role in the accident. And as regular listeners of the show know, if you think that someday you might be buying a new or slightly used Cirrus, please contact me today so I can arrange a free demo flight for you if you're thinking about a new Cirrus, but certainly to help you understand the many factors in terms of buying a new versus a slightly used Cirrus. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the world. And finally, take just a moment, if you would, to show your aviation friends how they can get the Aviation News Talk podcast. And if they don't know what a podcast is, just send them to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store for Android to download our dedicated Aviation News Talk podcast apps for iOS and Android. To get the app, just go to the App Store for your phone, do a search for Aviation News Talk, 3 words. And by the way, did I mention the apps are free? So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.